Hello, hello. This lecture we will be talking about metaphysics and the two primary philosophies within metaphysics, materialism and idealism. When we talk about metaphysics, what we're talking about is the nature of reality. What exists in the world? And this is an important aspect of doing philosophy because it relates directly to our existence and how we relate in the world. So, for instance, if you think that the world is made up of just physical matter, which a couple of philosophers we're going to look at believe, then it may be the case that things like nightmares or ghosts are not going to be as frightful. They're not going to be something that we fear as much because we'll be able to rationalize our way around not really believing these things to be harmful since they're purely in our imagination and they're not part of that physical world. But what, of course, is our defense of that? What are our reasons that get us to believe that the world is just the material, physical things around us? Perhaps ghosts, ghouls, monsters do exist, and the world is more than just the physical realm. As we go through this lecture, I'd like you to ask yourself, if ghosts are not real, then do ghosts matter? What about God? If God is not real, then does God or the religious phenomenon around God or deities matter? How about spirits? Do those matter? How do we really understand what exists beyond our physical understanding of the world? And does that stuff really make much of a difference in our lives if we don't believe it? And so the two overarching metaphysical theories that we're going to look at this week are materialism and idealism. Now, materialism is the idea that reality is ultimately made up of physical matter, and materialism is often linked with physicalism, meaning that the only thing that exists are physical things. This is not materialism as in, ooh, I want to buy a lot of stuff and I live based on the material possessions around me. This is more philosophical in that all we know about the world, all the world is just material, physical stuff. Now, contrast that with idealism. And idealism is that reality is ultimately non material or mental in nature. Now, most idealists accept the idea that there is material stuff, but that our world consists in our perceptions of that physical stuff, and our perceptions are the non material, idealistic sources of how we experience that material world. And that all we really know of the world is the idealism that we get through our perceptions. And so metaphysics is going to cover a lot of the different areas that we're going to cover, excuse me, that we're going to cover this month, this semester. Metaphysics of the mind, of yourself, an identity, of free will. And what we're doing when we discuss these topics is really identifying what it means for this thing to exist. So, take the mind, for instance. What is your mind? And is your mind separate from your brain? Is your mind part of consciousness? And what is that consciousness? And how about yourself? When you talk about identity, Is it the case that your identity is tied into the physical body, or is your identity something more immaterial and more idealistic? Same with free will. And beyond this course, we see metaphysics also including uh, different understandings of all manner of things, anything that you are questioning the existence of. Most commonly, I think, in most of our lives is the philosophy of love. What is it to love somebody? We all say that we love somebody, we all experience being in love and express our love, but what is love? Understanding what this concept refers to is really doing metaphysics of love or space or time or whatever. So let's begin with materialism, since this is going to be one of the more um, fundamental aspects of metaphysics. And this dates back to the ancient Greeks, even before Socrates' time, where Democritus believed that reality could be explained in terms of the matter and atoms in the world. Basically, the first known physicist, where he believed that in order to understand the world around us, all we needed to do is understand how the physical world is comprised. And by understanding the physicality of the world, we are understanding the world, since the world is physical. It's funny to note, too, that even Democritus believed in a soul, and to us, a soul would seem much more immaterial. But for Democritus, even the soul was comprised of atoms. And so our understanding of every aspect of our life could be broken down to physical stuff. And this physical stuff was all we really needed to understand the world. And so throughout this class, I'm going to interchange materialism and physicalism. There are slight differences, but for the purpose of what we're going to do in this class, they're essentially the same. So when I refer to materialism or when I refer to physicalism, it's just the idea that the world is comprised of physical stuff. And so when we're understanding or analyzing the world, all we're really doing is analyzing physics. And the deeper we get in terms of an understanding of physics, the more we're understanding the world. So, for instance, later on in this course, we'll talk about the theory of mind, we'll talk about consciousness, and we talk about um, the phenomenon of experiencing emotions and feelings and so forth. And when we consciously experience things, really all we're doing in terms of the physicalist perspective is enacting physical changes, perhaps in the brain, or having physical bodies relate to one another. It's just essentially everything being boiled down to the physical world. And in addition to the ancient Greeks, it moves on through more modern philosophers. Thomas Hobbes, for instance, in the 15th and 1600s, believed that we can know nothing about the world other than the measurable aspects. And think about this in terms of how we gain an understanding of facts now. For the most part, we do so through experimentation. But experimentation requires the physical world because we need to be able to quantify, we need to be able to measure, to see. Um, and even in instances of not being able to see, for instance, measuring and understanding black holes in the universe, our ability to understand black holes is based on our ability to measure things around the black holes and see where empty space is in relation to where there is stuff. And so uh, there's a strong push, especially today, to focus our attention on the physical world and basing our understanding of the world on materialism. And so this is probably one of the more common philosophies when it comes to understanding the world, when it comes to metaphysics. However, this will in fact be challenged a bit later in this lecture. And why we typically think that the world is made up of physical stuff, there are objections to this theory that really points out areas in life where we don't really see physical measurements or measurability. So, one of the most fundamental objections to materialism is this difficulty in really accounting for non-measurable phenomenon. Take, for instance, consciousness, as we expressed earlier, or thinking or wishing. When I'm thinking about a certain topic, it doesn't seem as if there's some quantifiable, measurable aspect to my thinking. It seems like it's something very non material. Same goes with my consciousness, for instance. When I'm conscious, focusing my attention, it doesn't seem as if that has a physical measurement. I can't measure my level of consciousness. I can't measure what it is to be conscious. And so, if we're to think of the world in terms of materialism and physicalism, then there must be a physicalist account of these very non seemingly physical phenomenon. Uh, Matter, for instance, when we think about matter, when we think about the physical world, we're thinking about mass, we're thinking about spatial dimensions. But consciousness doesn't really seem to have a spatial dimension. I mean, does it happen within my brain, within my body? Is it something that's limited? Is my thought of John Wayne to the left and behind my thought of eating lunch? Or are these just kind of jumbled up in the airwaves of my being? Consciousness seems to involve a level of subjectivity that isn't straightforwardly explained through material phenomenon. It's more experienced through certain brain states. We have synapses uh, that fire different neurons or neurons that fire along different synapses throughout the brain. But really, that subjectivity of what something feels like and the experience we get when we witness something or do something seems to not really have a physical correlation necessarily. And so, one of the obstacles that physicalists must overcome is an understanding of these seemingly non-physical phenomenon. And it's the physicalist's job, the materialist's job, to really account for this stuff in a material way. Now, of course, it could be the case that in the future, when we develop new technology, we'll be able to explain these things through a physical account. However, it seems as though that's not really on the horizon. There's too much subjectivity to consciousness, to something like dreaming or experiencing different feelings and so forth. Now, if physicalism, materialism uh, doesn't feel right for you, you seem to think that there is a God that exists, there are spirits, there are ghosts, then idealism might be more up your alley. And you wouldn't be alone because very prominent philosophers have taken up the philosophy of idealism. And what idealism is essentially the belief that reality is comprised of our minds and our perceptions of the world. So, whether an idealist necessarily believes in a single mind We'll be looking at George Berkeley, for instance, and his understanding that really everything resides within the mind of God, or you believe that uh, God doesn't necessarily exist, but the world is comprised of the many minds of all the individuals on earth, and we just go around experiencing reality, then this philosophy might be more appealing. And so again, Berkeley is going to be the major focus of idealism and metaphysics this week. And in fact, is the reading that you'll be doing in Idealist Theory of Knowledge, where he really explains how it how we experience the world and how we gain to know things. It's also going to be a kind of stepping stone for next week's lecture on empiricism and rationality, epistemology, and our understanding of how we gain knowledge or what it means to know something. And so, even though we're looking at Berkeley, we see a lot of roots also back to the ancient Greeks when we think about Pythagoras or Plato, even. When we talk about Plato, when we talked about his allegory of the cave last week, this understanding that reality potentially is beyond our understanding, and that what we're experiencing now in the world is just merely our being in the cave. And it's only uh, perhaps when we die or gain some higher level of understanding that we can really experience this world of forms or understanding of what is actually real. And so Berkeley claimed that consciousness, or the conscious mind and its ideas, are the only reality. Because we're having to perceive things through our senses, we're not actually getting a good look at the world, but just at what our senses tell us about the world. And so we're constantly making subjective, um, we're constantly understanding things in terms of the subjectivity of our senses. And we do this all differently. And so everybody's reality can be slightly different. Your reality of a bookcase that looks brown might be more to my reality that a bookcase looks more of a black color. Perhaps you understand something to taste one way, and I think of it tasting a different way. It's through these experiences that we understand the world, and our reality is based on those perceptions. And so when we use our senses, we see things like light or color, we feel hardness, we taste sweetness. And our reality is measured and based off of these sensory perceptions of the world. And we're really never understanding something for their objectivity. So when I experience the world, it can't be the same way that you experience the world because our senses are going to tell us two different things. Take, for instance, the idea of pain. I may experience a pinprick on my finger and it doesn't feel like anything much. You may experience a pinprick on the same part of your finger and it is excruciating. This goes to show that our perception of what it is to feel this pinprick is extremely different. And our realities about being pricked by a pin are not the same. To suggest then that we can measure physically this level of pain, if we go back to materialism, being able to quantify what it means to feel a pinprick, materialism doesn't really have an answer for that. Instead, we seem to think of the subjectivity that pain creates and how different it is for everybody, which goes to show that our understanding of the world is part of an idea that we have based on our perceptions. And so for Berkeley, there are two different kinds of ideas that are presented to the mind. Those that are short-lived and changeable, and those that are more regular. For instance, if I were to dream of my favorite vacation spot, or my dream vacation spot rather, I would think to myself, oh, definitely a beach in South America with great surf, um, just warm, sunny, not a cloud in the sky. However, perhaps later on in the summer, my vacation, my dream vacation spot will change. It's in the heart of winter now, and while we're in San Diego, it still is a little bit cold. And so all I'm doing is dreaming about these warm vacation spots. Maybe when August rolls around and I'm sick and tired of the heat, I'm sick and tired of sweating, my dream vacation spot might change to being something more like the Swiss Alps, where I can go snowboarding and sit in front of a fire in a log cabin somewhere. My perception then of this ideal vacation spot is constantly changing. And so this idealism is something that's completely within my control. Now, contrast that to a more orderly sense of idealism, the perception and understanding of the makeup of my house. When I walk into my house, everything is in a certain spot. When I leave my house and think back to my house, everything always seems in that same spot. I don't ever open the door after a long day work and think to myself, oh my gosh, everything is in a different place. I didn't remember where anything was. And so I can largely keep this enduring understanding of my environment within my house. It's something that I can really continue on believing. It's something that's not really changing. It's not within my power to change. I can't just simply, when I'm in the office, think to myself, oh yeah, my dresser's in a different spot than it was when I left my house. Uh, it's going to be in the same spot, barring it being moved by someone else who may come into my house, but my perception of the house is very stable and constant. Then you have a sense of objective idealism. Now, objective idealism is going to be slightly different than the subjective idealism, in that objective idealism is more of that certain uniformity and consistency that only comes from the mind of God. Uh, Berkeley was a firm believer in God and believed that God was the creator and overseer of the entire universe. And the differences that occur in subjective idealism can be grounded by the idea that God is overlooking and perceiving everything. So even if perhaps I forget that something, if I forget where my keys are and that my reality is saying that my keys are in some different place, God can see and understand and perceive my keys always being in the same place and keeps that level of uniformity um, from really breaking down into chaos, right? Because we wouldn't want to say with idealism that it's purely through my perceptions that I understand the world, and when I stop perceiving the world disappears. Obviously, the world can't disappear because you would need some anchor holding it in place. And for Berkeley, that anchor is going to be God. And so God produces essentially in our minds uh, our perceptions of this external world and makes it regular, makes it stable. So there are a few problems with this understanding of idealism. First, it almost seems as if we need this anchor, we need God to be in place in order to stabilize the universe. But more importantly, Uh, with idealism, there fails to be a distinction between what I perceive and the actual object. There's a disconnect of two separate realms where something that I'm looking at is perceived by me to exist in the world. However, there's also that actual object in the world that I'm not perceiving. And so it's difficult for idealism to really distinguish between my perception and the actual thing. Is there a way to actually see the object as the object, or is it always going to be my perception? What then can we say about the object itself? Does it have any objective qualities beyond those than what I perceive? It seems that idealism seems to really fall short when it comes to understanding the objective world, understanding the world that Berkeley thinks that God anchors. And because it's difficult to really understand that objective world, it seems as though idealism falls a bit short in really telling us about the world. Remember, metaphysics is supposed to explain the nature of reality. And if there's this thing that I'm perceiving, and that thing has an objective position in the world, our metaphysics and idealism should be able to explain that. But instead, all we really get are the perceptions of that thing. Then going back to this idea of God as the anchor, is it necessary that we have God there to really anchor down our objective reality? Like I had mentioned before, when I leave my house each day, I more or less perceive everything to look a certain way and be in the same spot. But for Berkeley, it's because God's perceiving that object even when I'm not. So that when I come home and I see the things in my house, they've largely stayed the same despite my not perceiving them because I'm away, because of this perception by the ultimate perceiver. But is this actually necessary for our understanding of the world? If we were to take away God, would this understanding of idealism collapse into an idea that when I turn away and not perceive something, it disappears, and then when I turn back, it reappears? That would seem a bit far-fetched, and I don't think there would be good grounds for believing that this would be the case for the world in terms of how things exist. They just appear and disappear as I'm perceiving them necessarily. It would seem as though the more commonsensical answer to the objective reality is that it's made of the physical stuff. And so we kind of go back to needing that physical world to explain the nature of reality. But then again, there's a bit missing from just believing that the world is physical. And so perhaps we can find some middle ground or explanation that could appeal to perhaps both of these theories. While not as popular as idealism or materialism, there's a third metaphysical theory that we're going to talk about, which is pragmatism. Pragmatism is different from the others in that pragmatists don't necessarily look to absolutes when it comes to understanding the world. Instead, we're to examine the consequences of our beliefs and really understanding how to get by in the world a bit easy. Thus, beliefs about reality are more meaningful only to the extent that there are consequences that affect how we act or what we do. And so if we philosophize about something that's not really important or necessary for our life, then it's not necessary to gain absolutes. Instead, we're looking mainly for things, or we're looking for answers to get by in the world a bit easier. We're looking for answers to help with outcomes and consequences. It is important to note, though, that even certain pragmatist philosophers understand the interconnectedness of doing philosophy with existing in the world. In fact, many social problems that we struggle with, whether it be issues of abortions or justice or rights, while it may be the case that we think that, oh, understanding metaphysics, understanding the nature of reality is for the philosophers, uh, if we're doing philosophy properly, if we're trying to get by in the world, these two things of doing philosophy and getting by are going to go hand in hand. For instance, understanding what it means to be a person is going to directly relate to the debates on abortion, or understanding the nature of justice is going to relate to uh, crime, incarceration is going to relate to government, and really when it comes down to creating a society or creating an organization to help better live our lives, we're going to need to understand certain aspects of philosophy, especially metaphysics and the existence and nature of reality. So that this notion that the value of philosophy depends on problem solving, it's not just at the heart of the pragmatist idea of metaphysics, but it's for every philosopher, and that the value of philosophy is going to be interconnected. Going back to Russell in the first week, when we understood that gaining a better understanding or doing philosophy is going to gain us a better understanding of cultures, gaining a better understanding of ourselves in order to create a more empathetic, more communal, a more cooperative system. It's about freeing ourselves, and this is going to be mainly what the pragmatist focuses his or her attention on, and ultimately solving particular problems that address these certain values, these certain dilemmas or problems that we face every day and that are meaningful to humans. When we think of pragmatism, we don't need to isolate it from materialism or idealism, as some pragmatists might suggest. Instead, we can use pragmatism as an excuse to better the value of philosophy, or an excuse to make philosophy more valuable to everyday people that wouldn't necessarily think about philosophizing over issues. Instead, pragmatism is an understanding of the consequences, or understanding philosophy to the extent of the consequences that it plays in a person's life. But the consequences are numerous. The consequences are constant. Our ability to understand philosophy will directly relate to all areas of life because of the different connections that we can make between the nature of things and our existence in the world, like free will, like moral responsibility, like justice or personhood. These things are all necessary when it comes to our everyday actions. We fight for them. We send courts to this, or we send um, cases to the Supreme Court to make decisions on these things because they're held so deeply, because they depend, or they encompass our government structure and our society, and how we get by. So there are necessities, there are consequences to doing anything in philosophy, and pragmatists ought to agree that the world being so interconnected, will require um, philosophizing in these ways. Now, the problem that you get with pragmatism, however, is the idea that if you're not thinking about philosophy in an interconnected way, you might often isolate certain, excuse me, certain uh, philosophies, certain ideas, and conceive of them in a kind of disinterested intellectual way, where we aren't dedicating enough scientific inquiry into the nature of certain aspects because they don't seem as though they have consequences in our lives. But that just seems to not be the case because of the way the world is interconnected. And then it would be hard pressed to find an instance of the things we philosophize about that aren't connected, that we're not interested in for some aspect. And also, pragmatism emphasizes a sense of multiple realities because since we have multiple interests, there would necessarily be multiple realities to the extent that they affect different people. Take, for instance, the idea that if I'm thinking pragmatically about my understanding of the world based on my needs, based on my wants, then I'm going to look at the world different than somebody who has different needs and wants. And so my reality is going to be much different than somebody else's reality. Now, this seems to this seems to make sense in some instances, right? When we think about, for instance, my understanding of the world and my reality as it relates to me here in the United States versus someone else's reality as it relates to them in, let's say, Yemen. Someone who is born and living in Yemen is going to have a different reality, a different perception of the world. But going back to idealism, we seem to have a similar problem where I have an understanding of the world and the person from Yemen has a different understanding of the world. And how does that relate to what the world actually is objectively? Is there even an objective world, or is it based solely on our perceptions? And if it's based solely on our perceptions, it would seem as though it would be difficult for anyone to really connect and understand things in an objective, scientific way. We would think, or we do think, that a lot of scientific innovation and discoveries have been objectively understood. So we objectively know that the earth revolves around the sun. And it would be incorrect for someone to perceive it otherwise. Even though that's part of their reality, we could respond by saying, well, no, your reality is incorrect. In fact, the earth revolves around the sun is the correct objective reality. So when it comes to pragmatism, if we're what's pragmatic for me is different from what's pragmatic to you, it would seem as though there are multiple realities, when in fact, scientifically, I think we would be inclined to say, well, no, there's one objective reality out there. Wrapping things up, it's important to understand that what we know about the world is going to be an important part about how we live our lives. Going back to the discussion, going back to one of the first questions posed in this slideshow, if I don't think of the world as being immaterial, then clearly thoughts of ghosts, thoughts of damnation by an immaterial God won't be as effective on me as it will someone who does believe that. And it's important to know which position is correct. And it's important to know how we understand the world when it comes to other aspects like free will or personal identity or justice. So, we really need to give thought to the nature of reality and what is the nature of the stuff that we are constantly interacting with on a daily basis. It's through understanding the world that we're really going to get a sense of meaning or purpose, or we're going to dedicate our efforts and so forth. Um, then looking at something like materialism or idealism, is there a middle ground? Is there a way to have both? It would seem as though not really, but perhaps maybe I understanding how perceptions can be based in the material world, or how materialism can be based in the idealistic world, that we can really try and understand these two theories as they work maybe together instead of in contrast with one another. And so hopefully this week it gets you to think about what you think the world is and how you know what exists in the world.